Okay, let's dive into an explainer today that completely challenges, well, pretty much everything we thought we knew about the biblical creation of man and the journey of salvation. If you've ever felt like the standard narrative of, just saying a quick prayer and instantly being saved leaves a whole lot of spiritual depth on the table, you are going to find this incredibly fascinating. Think about it. We usually just assume humanity started out spiritually complete, living in absolute perfection, and then we just fell from grace. But as we dig into the original Hebrew and Greek source texts, they tell a completely different, much more profound story. It's actually a story of process, of growth, and the true nature of what it literally means to be saved.
All right, part one, the lost essence of salvation.
Now, notice the stark contrast here between the really popular modern idea of a one-time salvation ticket, like it's just a finished event in the past, and the original biblical concept of a continuous, living process. For centuries, people have treated salvation like a simple transaction at a counter. But the original language reveals this ongoing, dynamic journey where our soul is actively being purified and filled with the knowledge of truth over time.
And to prove this, we actually just need to look at the grammar of Genesis 1. It heavily uses this fascinating thing called the wav consecutive. Basically, it's a grammatical structure showing that creation wasn't just a static event that started and abruptly stopped in the ancient past. Instead, it indicates a continuous, unfolding action. Meaning, the work God started on the sixth day, yeah, it's still being actively completed within us right now.
Let's move to part two, Nephesh Chayah, or the soul state. So when Genesis 2:7 says man became a living soul, the Hebrew phrase used is Nephesh Chayah. But get this is the mind-blowing part. That exact same phrase is used earlier in Genesis 1 to describe sea creatures and land animals. The first Adam actually wasn't created as a perfect, fully realized spirit. He was created as a living creature, bound by carnal thoughts, earthly knowledge of good and bad, and operating purely on biological, animal instinct. Which means humanity started out living in a state of darkness and the shadow of death, exactly as Matthew chapter 4 describes. We were driven by this fleshly, animalistic mind, totally consumed with earthly survival and the chaotic, shifting knowledge of good and evil. We were essentially operating on basic physical instinct. This biological soul desperately needed a massive upgrade. It needed to be purified by the true knowledge of the Word and brought to life by the spiritual, life-giving spirit of the last Adam, Jesus. And honestly, this is exactly why the psalmist wrote this verse. If we don't gain spiritual understanding, if our inner thoughts aren't actively cleansed and purified by the knowledge of truth, we just remain in that initial state of darkness. We end up living out our entire lives operating on nothing but physical, animal survival instincts, completely missing out on the divine upgrade that was intended for us all along. Which brings us to part 3, the inner self conquered by truth. Remember how on the sixth day humans were commanded to subdue the earth? The Hebrew word there is kavash, which literally means to tread underfoot or bring into subjection. But spiritually speaking, this has absolutely nothing to do with clear-cutting forests or farming. It's an internal command. It means taming the wild, chaotic, serpent-like earthly knowledge within our own minds. It's the incredibly difficult process of conquering our fleshly thoughts with actual truth. We actually see this vividly in the New Testament. When the source texts describe Jesus walking on the water or simply walking around, the Greek word is peripateo, it's this profound spiritual metaphor. He's actively subduing the chaotic fleshly thoughts of our inner, animalistic nature. The water represents that chaotic, earthly knowledge from below, and his walking upon it is the ultimate kavash, treading it underfoot to finally bring order. So how exactly does he conquer this within us? Well, as Isaiah brilliantly points out here, it is exclusively through his knowledge. The knowledge of Christ, the truth, acts as the ultimate cure. It purifies our soul from its primal state. The process of our soul being saved is quite literally this, our inner thoughts being completely filled and cleansed by the holy word of truth, completely overpowering those old, deep-seated animalistic instincts. All right, part 4, homologio and the concept of passive confession. We so often think of confession as, gritting our teeth and forcing ourselves to yell, "I believe." But the biblical Greek word for confession is homologeo. It comes from homo, meaning same, and logos, meaning word. So it literally means to speak the exact same word as God.
And the catch is, you can only actually do this when His truth has entirely filled your mind, completely replacing that old earthly knowledge. This is a total paradigm shift because it reveals that true salvation and confession operate entirely in the passive voice. That famous concept in Romans about believing with your heart to reach righteousness and confessing with your mouth to reach salvation, it isn't something you aggressively force. Rather, as the word of truth fills you and your soul is saved, the Holy Spirit comes. And when the Spirit arrives, it naturally pours out the holy words of the Father. You live as a spirit that simply echoes, or homologeo, the divine word. The ability to speak the exact same words as Christ is just the natural passive result of your soul and spirit being truly transformed. Let's just trace this beautiful progression for a second. We start with a dark, animalistic soul driven purely by fleshly instinct. Then we are actively conquered and purified by the knowledge of truth. That creates the space for the arrival of the Holy Spirit, which finally brings us to passive confession, where we effortlessly and naturally speak the exact same words as the Lord. This right here is the true end goal of faith. And that brings us to our final section, the finally completed temple. When Jesus was crucified, the massive veil in the temple was torn in two. Now, while this was a historical event, it's also a direct mirror of what must happen inside of us. That veil represents our first tent, our fleshly, animalistic ego. For the divine to truly enter and take up residence, that old animalistic self, filled with earthly knowledge and base instinct, has to be completely torn apart and destroyed. The writer of Hebrews captures this dynamic perfectly. As long as our first tabernacle, our primal, earthly, beastly self is standing strong and ruling our minds, the path into the holiest place within us remains completely blocked off. The Holy Spirit literally cannot take up full residence while the inner animal is still sitting on the throne. But once that veil of the flesh is finally torn and your soul is completely purified by the knowledge of truth, the Holy Spirit enters. This is the exact moment the Trinity unites within you, finally completing the inner temple. This isn't just a nice poetic metaphor. It's the actual realized journey of humanity moving from a mere biological creature to a literal divine dwelling place. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what Peter meant. The end of your faith is exactly this, the salvation of your soul. It is a lifelong active process of your soul being pulled out from the darkness of animalistic instinct, purified by the truth, filled with the Holy Spirit, and molded into a completed temple that natively speaks the very words of God.
So I'll leave you with this final thought to ponder, based on everything we've looked at today. If salvation is truly this continuous, active journey of your soul being conquered by truth to become a dwelling place for the divine, are you settling for a superficial, one-time ticket? Or are you actively allowing the truth to conquer your inner nature to build that temple? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep seeking the truth.